If you'd all take a seat, we're just about to get ready and start. Thank you. Oh, hi, Amy. Hi, Eric. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're delighted to have you here. I'm Barbara Lane. I'm the Director of Arts and Ideas here at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. I see a lot of familiar faces, so welcome back. To those of you who are here for the first time, thank you. Welcome. I hope we'll see you again. Turn off your cell phones. You will have an opportunity to buy books from our good friends at Green Apple following tonight's program. We support San Francisco's independent bookstores. We hope you do too. You will get your books signed by Peter Godwin and Peter Orner, so please take advantage of that opportunity and support Green Apple. I also want to draw your attentions to this fabulous brochure done by our own marketing department that was on your seats when you came in. This is BookFest. BookFest is happening February 23rd to 28th right here at the JCC in a number of rooms throughout the building. Peter Orner, who's here tonight, will be back. It's Peter Orner Month here at the JCC. Word for Word will be doing a performance from the Esther Stories, his story collection, but also Nicole Krauss, Miranda July, a panel on Harold Bloom featuring Sam Tannenhouse, New York Times Book Review editor, a panel on Cynthia Ozick, with Cynthia Ozick appearing via Skype, and a panel on Philip Roth with Joyce Carol Oates right here. So take a look at this, and we hope to see you at BookFest. Okay, now for tonight's program. As a journalist, Peter Godwin covered wars. As a soldier, he's fought them, but nothing prepared him for the surreal mix of desperation and hope he encountered when he returned to his native Zimbabwe in 2008. Robert Mugabe, the country's dictator for 30 years, had finally lost an election, but instead of conceding power, Mugabe launched a brutal campaign of terror against his own people. With foreign correspondents banned, Godwin, also the author of When a Crocodile Eats the Sun and Mukiwa, was one of the few observers to bear witness to this period locals call the fear. Here tonight in conversation with Peter Godwin is another writer who's immersed himself in the story of Zimbabwe's tragic decline. Peter Orner conducted hundreds of hours of interviews with Zimbabweans for his book, Hope Deferred, Narratives of Zimbabwean Lives. Peter Orner is also the author of the novels Love and Shame and Love, and The Second Coming of Mavalish in Congo, and the collection The Esther Stories. Our hope in bringing these two writers together is not simply to describe the horror of being in a country destroyed by a ruthless tyrant, but also to shine a light on the great heroism and resilience Zimbabweans have shown. And of course, we hope exposing these stories ultimately helps to combat tyranny wherever it lives. Please join me in welcoming Peter Godwin and Peter Orner to the JCCSF.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Barbara, for the introductions. I'm really, really honored to be here and looking forward to this conversation. I also look forward to the period after the conversation where we're going to open it up for questions. But first, I'm going to have a few questions for Peter. And I'm going to start with, first of all, I want to say that, what's that? You can hear me in terms of, you're good, okay. First, I want to say that what is so wonderful about the fear and tragic about the fear is the fact that you get a real personal look at what's happened in Zimbabwe from someone who knows it extremely, extremely well, a native of Zimbabwe. And I just want to talk a little bit, just as by way of introduction, to ask Peter if you could. I mean, I was first in Zimbabwe myself in the early 90s, and while there were cracks in the facade, it was a much different country than it is now. And I was so struck by the vibrancy of it, the culture, the education system, how good things seemed to be. And I, of course, didn't know half of what I know now from reading your book and other things. But tell me about the impetus for your return to Zimbabwe in this book. What were you hoping to find?
Well, can you all hear me? Is that okay? Excuse me. I mean, there are two parts to this question. I'll try not to be too loquacious. The first is this impression, which is absolutely true, that Zimbabwe was, relatively speaking, a land of milk and honey up from independence in 1980. And bear in mind that we had just come out of a vicious civil war, which is what it was, 7-year war, in which 50, 60,000 people were killed. And in 1980, we really, before the South Africans invented it, were a rainbow nation. That Mugabe actually, if you go back and look at the speech he gave in 1980 after he won those first elections, it was an extremely reconciliatory speech in which he overtly addressed the white population, for example, in particular the farmers, and said to them, you should stay and contribute to the new Zimbabwe and go back to the farms and produce food and crops for export, etc., etc. The West thought that he was going to be a communist and nationalize everything because that was what a lot of the wartime rhetoric had been. And bear in mind that we were still in the middle of the Cold War then in general, when Africa was used as a proxy battleground between East and West. And so through the 1980s and 90s, Zimbabwe became this sort of beacon on the African hill. And it's worth noting that Zimbabwe's a strange little country because it's greater than the sum of its parts. It's become emblematic of so much more. So, for example, it became for many years the proof that Africa could work, that Africa could succeed. It had an extraordinary infrastructure, a strong economy, it exported food, and it, most of all, as you alluded to, it had its fantastic education system. One of Mugabe's real first achievements, education and health, and it eventually had the highest literacy rate in Africa, in fact, and higher than many countries outside of Africa. And so the conventional wisdom was that here's Zimbabwe, this enormously successful country, and then in the late 1990s, basically, Robert Mugabe sort of gets a sudden rush of blood to the head and turns into this dictator, this villain that we all love to hate, that the world then piles on and says he's a villain, whatever. And that's the conventional wisdom. That's the sort of the accepted narrative, if you like. If this were a movie, that would be the trajectory, the arc of the plot. That's what it would be. Unfortunately, my view of this is that that's complete nonsense, and it doesn't bear up to any scrutiny at all. And that something completely different happened, and that even when Zimbabwe seemed to be vibrant and happy and whatever, the seeds of its own destruction were already being sown. And I'll try and keep this brief, but it's important because I think this is one of the main ways that Zimbabwe projects a plot, if you like, that's bigger than itself, that's something that is a cautionary tale. And the reason I keep going back to Zimbabwe as a canvas, and sometimes it's like Groundhog Day for me. I feel like I'm going back and back, and it's enough already. And it's like conducting literary keyhole surgery, that I'm sort of in there doing this little thing. But it has these universals in it. It really does. And the plot is so dramatic, in a sense. One of the things, you teach writing, I know, professionally, and one of the paradoxes in writing is that when you're in search of the universal, instead of pulling back, you would imagine logically you would pull back to find the universal, but actually, weirdly, the universal is in the detail. You zoom in. So if I'm writing these books about Zimbabwe, and I'm sure when you are too, you face this conundrum, which is that, and I'm sure even in this room, that there are some people in this room who've never been to Africa and know where Zimbabwe is, perhaps, but don't know much about the internal politics in Zimbabwe. And there are other people in this room who probably grew up in Zimbabwe and know it intimately and can know more about what happened there last week than I do. But if you both have this book in your hands and you're both reading it, how am I going to write for those two people in my mind's eye without confusing and bewildering one and condescending and boring the other? And in trying to sort of find that Venn diagram, that sweet spot, if you like, where you can both read it. You find it in the detail. You zoom in the universal, and that's what Zimbabwe has in huge dollops. The reason I say that I don't think it's true, briefly, is that in 1980, I mean, let's go to the character of Mugabe himself. The thing is that in Zimbabwe, what we have is we've only ever had one leader since 1980. We've had no other. I wrote a piece. I was asked by the Wall Street Journal to write a piece on the final retirement of Nelson Mandela. He was sort of pulled back to the Transkei and said he's not going to give any more public statements. And in trying to honestly assess what I thought his real achievements have been, not to the rest of us as an icon of someone of forgiveness and someone who spent 28 years in prison and then came out apparently without malice. That's mostly, I mean, it's important, but it's mostly important overseas. What is his legacy in South Africa itself? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that one of his main legacies to South Africa was the fact that he retired. He stood down after one term, much like George Washington. I mean, he stood aside, and that South Africa is now on its fourth president. Now, the ANC is still in power and whatever, but you don't have a cult of personality. Now, if anyone was ever set up to be able to have a cult of personality, it was Nelson Mandela. But he didn't. Unfortunately, Mugabe did, and so has become sort of very concentrated. But what happened was, in my view of Mugabe, is that he has been very consistent in an inconsistent world. So that you can accuse him of many things, but inconsistency is not one of them. So let's just quickly look at it. The first thing, my thesis is that what he has always done is whenever he is faced with political problems, he reacts with violence. He reaches in and finds a solution in violence. And if you go back even to, let's start with the guerrilla war itself. Now, the guerrilla war may very well have been, I mean, most of us believe it was, morally defensible, that you come up against an intransigent white government that won't hand over to majority rule, and eventually force of arms dictates. So, but nevertheless, what it is a ultimately violent response to a political problem, and it works. In 1980, in those first elections, where the guerrillas and the army and everybody was supposed to pull back from into barracks and into assembly points to demilitarize the electoral scene, Mugabe left 1,000, 2,000 of his main guerrillas out in the field. They went through the rural areas. They said to the people, listen, you vote for ZANU-PF, or ZANU as it still was then, or a luta continua. The struggle goes on, the war will continue. He didn't need to do that. He was going to win anyway. But the point is, what you see in that action is someone who's more interested in power than in democracy. And then in 1983-84, which is really when the scales fell from my eyes, not because I was such a great political scientist, because I was a rookie journalist who saw it. He sent his North Korean trained 5th Brigade down into Matabeleland, where they killed probably 20,000 civilians, black civilians, and the world did nothing, absolutely nothing. Once again, political problem, violent solution, it works. For the next 15 years, he doesn't have to be violent because Zimbabwe's a one-party state. And in that time, though, the seeds of our destruction are sown because all of the institutions which should be building up to be independent, those things that really keep a country stable, the judiciary, the civil service, all of these things become so utterly politicized, even the army and the police, that they work for the party and not for the government. And then basically in 2000 he loses a referendum that would allow him to increase term limits. And it's at that point that a new opposition emerges, and he reacts violently again. So I think he's been completely consistent.
And here's the rub, and this is where your book sort of starts, and that is knowing what you know about Mugabe, knowing that he has been consistent, and as you say, from 1983 onward, the violence has been used always for the sole purpose of staying in power. And yet, 2008 comes along, and you have this heartbreaking line very early in the book. I'm on my way home to Zimbabwe to dance on Robert Mugabe's grave. And, and I think a lot of international observers, I've following Zimbabwe a lot myself, many people thought that some corner had been turned. You set it up by describing the emergence of the MDC, which between 2000 and 2008 starts to gain a considerable amount of power, or at least becomes a player, let's say, in the population. So why was 2008 a moment where we thought, and you thought, something would happen differently?
I mean, the thing to remember about Mugabe as well is that he is not as other dictators. He's certainly not as other African dictators. He's no Idi Amin, who was the heavyweight boxing champion of the King's African Rifles. He's not a Nigerian general with medals strewn across his chest. He's deeply intellectual. He's very intelligent, and he's sort of oddly fastidious. When Mugabe looks in the mirror, he doesn't see a dictator looking back. He sees a liberator. He sees someone who still inhabits the moral high ground. And I think to that degree, he probably is pathological in that he actually this is what he believes. And you can see even now that when people vote against his party, ZANU-PF, and you can see it not just in him, but in supporters, especially the older supporters of ZANU-PF, the office bearers, there's a perplexity about it, that you can see them saying, how can you vote against us? If it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have a vote. We liberated the country. We're not like some other political party that when you get tired of it, you vote it out of office and you replace it with someone else. That's not how this works. And that's always the danger when you've had a revolution, that you have a party emerges that has this founding mythology that's so strong and so potent that often it becomes the foundation of a one-party state. And you see it, in all these revolutions. In the Soviet Union, you see it in Cuba. When I was working for the BBC, I once went to Cuba for 3 months to make a documentary. And I arrived in Cuba and I looked around and I thought, I totally recognize this place. I'm home. There was just, what seems so similar about it is that when you're in Cuba, it's as if the revolution happened last Thursday. It's sort of, the way that they talk. And similarly in Zimbabwe, if you listen to ZANU-PF, it's like the war happened just the other day. Not back. It wasn't over in 1979. But in those elections in 2008, what had happened was already the MDC had got. In the elections before, was winning all the seats in the cities and the towns. It consistently won all the seats in the south, in Matabeleland. But what happened, what he was so unready for, and I think what actually, for that sort of tantalizing window of probably only 2 or 3 weeks in the end, what really knocked the stuffing out of him was that in his heartland, in Mashonaland, east and west, and central, his support started to erode even there, and these people were the people who had enjoyed the largesse of his power, and that I think caught him completely unawares and actually also screwed up their electoral arithmetic as well. Right. And so there was this moment in 2008 where it actually looked like he was suddenly feeling his age, and from everything that I heard, his wife, who's nearly 40 years younger than him, what started to hurt her was these targeted sanctions against 100 of the senior people in his party, including him and her. That means they can't shop at Harrods, and they can't do all these things. They can't go and I think she was feeling that a bit, and wanting him to retire, and putting pressure on him just to retire with dignity and hand over and whatever. And I think he was ready to do that, and it was in that moment that I went back.
And then so you're there there around the time of this moment, this glimmer of maybe irrational hope, but some kind of people thinking that that the election was going forward in a relatively fair way, at least the first one in 2008. And then of course what happened was, unfortunately, is Morgan Tsvangirai from MDC wins the popular vote, but by not enough, so it's by law there's a runoff. And so in between the moment of the original election and the runoff is an incredible spate of political violence. Rape as a political tool, intimidation, people fleeing the country by the hundreds of thousands. And you have this, but to kind of broaden it a little bit, because what happens, what you're describing about Mugabe's behavior is often this sort of, when he's in trouble, he'll move in and do this. And you have this moment in the book. You're in Howard Mission Hospital, and it's a particularly moving scene where just in terms of the writing of the book, I want to say that, because we're talking a lot about politics, as we should, but you have a way of kind of discovering on the page, you're not coming at it as if you know it already. And what happens in Howard Mission Hospital is you see actually on the ground people who have been affected by the violence. And you have this, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's the idea that Mugabe doesn't have to commit genocide or literally kill people to control them. He can do other things. He can maim. He can attack your family. He can do all these other things. And just so, by way of moving past 2008, could you talk a little bit about that personal experience?
Right. I think what happened in 2008 was also interesting in that when they realized that they'd lost, the way they rig elections, the very fact that they have elections in Zimbabwe and then we call Mugabe dictator, we should explain. Because Mugabe, as I said, is a sort of rather fastidious dictator. He wants the appearance of democracy. He wants to be able to say we have these elections and whatever. But of course, as Stalin said, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. And in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF counts the votes, essentially. And so some of the manipulation, you can fiddle elections in all manner of ways. I've reported many of them in my time, from intimidating people and all that to begin with, to even to in the count itself. And some of the fiddling they did was sort of laughably basic. They were just literally swapping the numbers around or adding a zero, even when the votes then are more than the actual number of people voting and whatever. There are lots of ways, but even with all that, they couldn't quite get it right. There were certain changes that got them wrong, and also the opposition got these disposable cameras and took pictures of the votes on the walls, which is one of the concessions they got, and
posted them.
And there were, I think, 9,000 polling stations, and they managed to take photographs, I think, about 4,000 of them before ZANU-PF realized what was going on and chased all the election agents away. And so there were some teething problems there. But you're absolutely right. What happened then was that, but before we knew there was going to be a runoff, there was this bizarre, eerie silence that they wouldn't announce the results, and they kicked all the foreign journalists out. In fact, what was really going on, the beginning of it was an attempt to give Mugabe an exit package to get him out. And I saw several of the versions of it that were being brokered by Americans and Brits and all sorts of things, the diplomats, to try and give Mugabe a kind of graceful way out, to make him some titular president, to give him, a big pension and this and that. The opposition was offering him immunity from prosecution, although, of course, as an aside, the fact that The Hague now exists is interesting, because one of the laws of unintended consequences is that it's not enough that your own opposition in country gives you a free pass from things that have gone on. You've still got The Hague sitting there. So that sometimes stiffens the resolve of dictators, oddly. And so this wait and wait and wait. And in that wait, my sister and I actually went back to the Eastern Highlands where we grew up, to a place called Chimanimani. And on the way back, we started in the twilight seeing people being pushed along on paths and things in wheelbarrows. Right. And I remember Georgina and I made some flippant remark about how bad the economy had got. Bear in mind that at this point, Zimbabwe had gone from the beacon on the hill to the sort of paragon of the failed state. The currency, the Zimbabwe dollar, was halving in value every 24 hours. It had the highest ratio of orphans in the world. It had the lowest life expectancy in the world, down to 34 or 35. The health system had comprehensively collapsed. The schooling system had closed effectively. From having this wonderful education system, it had completely gone. Employment was something like 8%, not unemployment. The economy had been absolutely devastated. So we saw these people coming back and thinking that they couldn't get fuel for vehicles, or you had to just, instead of getting an emergency taxi, you got a wheelbarrow. And in fact, these were the first people being brought back from torture bases. These were torture victims, and they'd had all their bones broken, and they were being wheeled back just sort of in the twilight by their relatives. And again, Mugabe's very canny in that he understands that in the West in particular, there is a sort of threshold over which if the body count goes over that threshold, and it moves according to different things, then there's a danger of intervention. And so you have to keep your dirty tricks below that threshold. So what they and there's this chilling phrase that I've now said, it's called smart genocide. You can't do a Rwanda anymore. You can't have that kind of body count. Even in Libya, if you look at it, it got too high there as well. But if you torture people, so and I spoke to hundreds of people in the end who'd been through these torture camps, and it was so scripted. It was so, I could finish their sentences by the end because it was the same. And it's important to remember this in terms of The Hague and everything else. This wasn't some sort of, Liberian or Sierra Leonean anarchy. This was much more like fascism. This is the Zimbabwe army and the security forces is hierarchical. It's got a orders are given, they go down, things are done as they're ordered, as they're commanded. And ironically they used the schools as the main torture bases. These schools that weren't working, and people were brought in, very badly tortured, and then to coin an angling phrase, on a catch and release basis, they were then let out, and they were trundled home by their relatives or whatever, barely alive. And they acted as human billboards, if you like, advertisements for what happens to you if you oppose the regime. And you could see when they got back to their home villages and things, just the anxiety radiating out when people looked at them and thought, that's the price you pay if you oppose the regime. But he was careful to make sure that the violence, and the reason I wrote the book in the present tense, and actually, to be fair, in the first person, was because I wanted to try and paint the picture of the sort of confusion that reigns in real time when because initially we were hearing these reports and thinking, this can't be true. I mean, not on this scale. And just thinking, seriously? I mean, are they exaggerating? And slowly, as you go through hospitals and whatever, and you suddenly realize that just how widespread this was, and it was absolutely breathtaking. Just how there's an astonishing statistic I saw the other day, given that the schools, as I said, had been torture bases, which was that I think I'm right, and I'll have to check this, but I think 56% of school teachers in Zimbabwe have now been the victim of political violence. Over half of the school teachers. Even
as recently as this week, there's people in ZANU-PF threatening teachers. Even now, the teachers that are left, and that it's what's so heartbreaking is that these angles that are taken using the schools as a place of this kind of horror. One of the questions that I would get when I talk to people about this oral history that I did was. And this was around the time of Egypt and the so-called Arab Spring, before Libya, though. And I wonder, one question, and I think it was an unfair question, but one that was on people's minds. So they asked me, and the question was, well, when's the Arab Spring going to come to a place like Zimbabwe? In particular, what is it about Zimbabwe that people aren't rising up and saying enough already? And the context is so different that I sometimes wasn't sure quite where to start. So I ask you the same unfair question. Yeah, and I think, it is a fair question in a kind of macro sense, and I understand why people ask it. My answer would be that Zimbabwe actually had its Arab Spring. I mean, that's what you saw in the early 2000s, is that when a people rose up against a dictator and voted in great numbers against him, even though they had no idea what would happen to them, and that they've been doing that ever since, is the first thing. And the second thing is that which is part of the same answer. People say, well, Zimbabweans are somehow pacific. They won't do anything. They won't actually if they all rose up physically. But Zimbabweans aren't pacific. I mean, I was in the war. It went on for 7 years. It wasn't, they will rise up. It's not a lack of courage. But what's happened is that the opposition movement, the movement for democratic change, which subsequently split, etc., but they, from the very beginning, on all branches, made it clear that they were a non-violent movement, that they were following in the paths of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, that this is what they were going to do. And I've talked to Morgan Tsvangirai many times about this, about
because one gets very frustrated watching Zimbabwe just slowly, bleed to death, and thinking, what, if you got 300,000 people into the streets, okay, maybe they shoot, and kill even hundreds. But actually, what you've seen is a silent genocide at the moment. Is that because of this toxic, sort of perfect storm of collapse of healthcare, highest HIV at one point in the world, and no food. I mean, very bad malnutrition. Is that you have a kind of creeping genocide, and you have cholera and typhoid and all sorts of things. And these people are dying out in the bush. They're not even being recorded anymore. And I think that at some point, there will probably be done a kind of extrapolation of how many people we've lost, because it's difficult to tell, because so many people have left the country, and again, they sneak over the border in their millions now, and so it's difficult to tell how many people have died, how many people have left, and I think at some point, they'll do a study like the Harvard study of the period of time when Thabo Mbeki was in his AIDS denial stage and refused to allow ARVs into South Africa, that they say, upwards of 400,000 people died from this, and I think that in Zimbabwe it'll be a great number. But the fact is that Morgan Tsvangirai doesn't want to have the blood of the youth on his hands and push them into the street. And now, of course, it's moved on. Now we're in a much stranger situation where the opposition has been put into a sort of government of national unity with the ruling party. There was a very strange moment in Africa where, when the wrong party won, it was declared a draw. So, for example, it started with Kenya, where when the wrong party won, they were pushed together and said, "Oh, you've got to rule together." And then Zimbabwe, and then Cote d'Ivoire, if you remember, when Alassane Ouattara won the elections, and Laurent Gbagbo, the president, wouldn't accept it, and so they sent Thabo Mbeki as part of the thing, and he said, "I know, let's call it a draw." And I just feel like that ultimately isn't really democracy. I mean, it's a and that's been the problem. So that's where we are in Zimbabwe at the moment.
I have a somewhat related question. That is that, some estimates are that 1.5 to 4 million Zimbabweans have crossed the border into South Africa and are dispersed now at this point around the world. And yet, there are many people still in the country working very hard every day to try and make this, to change this, in spite of everything you've been saying. And many of those people are profiled in your book. People like Roy Bennett, who did his time in prison, but lesser known people as well. And I wonder if you could talk about something about the resilience of the people that you, on the ground, that continue to, in spite of everything we've been saying, are still there fighting this out.
Right. Roy Bennett is actually he's in London. He had to flee in the end. His life was made completely untenable. Right. And there are people who've gone back post 2008. But there are people there doing their best. But it's a strange economy, and in some ways, I mean, even if you look at farmers, for example, and the few white farmers who are still there, to coexist with the ZANU-PF regime is to be compromised often in one way or another. I mean, my father used to have this ludicrous rule that my father used to say that if we all stop, if nobody gives bribes, then you won't have corruption. So he said it's our fault. It's whoever gives the bribe is as responsible as the people who are taking the money. And if nobody gives it, then it won't happen. And in Zimbabwe, there are not many people who don't give it anymore. And I mean, in terms of South Africa, it's interesting because many of the biggest chunk of the people who fled Zimbabwe, and I'm principally talking about black Zimbabweans, the pride of the country, the leadership. Zimbabwe had this, I can't impress you enough, this astonishing pool of technocrats, of people, very efficient and good at what they did. And they're, half of them are running South Africa, they're running the JSE and all sorts of things. I mean, and yet in other respects, that flood of Zimbabweans down in South Africa has at times threatened to destabilize South Africa. And so one of the big question marks, I think, one of the things that people often ask is, why doesn't South Africa do more to intervene and to stop what's been going on in Zimbabwe? And the fact is that they could. I mean, really they could. If they had the political will to end the conflict in Zimbabwe, they could do it, in my view, in a couple of months if they really wanted to. And we have a precedent with John Foster doing it to Ian Smith at a certain point, saying, enough now. And the goods trains stopped running on time and one thing and another. Zimbabwe depends overwhelmingly on South Africa for trade routes and all sorts of things. And they've been ultimately, and going back to Bush, who said that Thabo Mbeki then was his point man on Zimbabwe, that America and the West in general have tended to defer to South Africa as the regional great power to sort out Zimbabwe because it's in its own backyard. And actually, and South Africa has been sort of woefully, I think, hasn't been an honest broker in this at all. And that they've basically protected the regime, even where they've wanted to switch Mugabe personally, they've protected ZANU-PF. And my belief is that the reason they do this is a sort of macro, slightly structural reason, which is that if you look at all the countries in Southern Africa that have fought anti-colonial wars, where have a similar revolutionary background, if you like, to ZANU-PF, all of those parties are still in power. So if you go from ZANU-PF itself in Zimbabwe to Frelimo in Mozambique, to the ANC in South Africa, to SWAPO in Namibia, to the MPLA in Angola, they're all still in power. Those movements are all still in power, and it's not in the interests of any one of them to have any other of them lose power, because it shows that they're vulnerable to an upstart. Other countries, Zambia, whatever, where there hasn't been this, an actual anti-colonial struggle to the same extent, you can live with it, but not these ones.
And yet the complexity, as you alluded to earlier, is, Mandela has known always about Mugabe, and it's heartbreaking to me that South Africa has been so paralyzed on this issue. One of the stories of Zimbabwe is the Zimbabwean diaspora now living to the millions in all over South Africa and making do. And you have a part of your book where you're in Johannesburg in the city center at a Methodist church where many of the refugees from Zimbabwe are just eking out a life. It's a heartbreaking situation. I want to ask you one final question, because I got the 10-minute sign. I don't know, and it's probably down to 6 or 4 or something. But one of the ways that Mugabe also stays in power is that, as political parties do, as people do, they fight internally. So the MDC, which is a credible opposition party, unfortunately, part of the ways that things just go on an everyday basis in Zimbabwe now are that much of the infighting in MDC is causing a lack of ability to really be a straight broker against Mugabe. So I wonder if you could talk, because you talk at length about the splits in MDC.
Right. I mean, the Zimbabwean opposition has had a number of problems. I mean, in a sense, I think they set out on what they thought would be a sprint, and it's turned into a marathon.
Right.
And from the beginning, it's been more of a movement than a party. It's a kind of grab bag of different sections of society, from city dwellers to sort of university intellectuals to southerners to ultimately white farmers came on board. So it's a lot of groups that in the normal pattern of life might be inimical to one another, given their interests. So it's hardly a surprise that fault lines would start to emerge over a 10-year period. But having said that, the most immediate problem that we've got is that in many ways it seems to me that the West's policy towards Zimbabwe has been to wait for Mugabe to die, which isn't really a policy at all. And God knows he seems to have very good genes. So he's and his mother, lived for many a year. And
one of the most horrific quotes in the book is you say you quote Mugabe as saying, "I will never." He's talking about British intervention, but in general, he's saying, "I will never stand it, dead or alive. Even my ghost will not stand
right.
it."
Right, and when he went into hospital, ultimately I think it was for Botox or something. But he went to hospital recently, and a friend of mine heard that he was. I said, "Oh, Mugabe's back in hospital," and he said, "Oh, nothing minor, I hope." But a student of mine. One of the great things about living in New York is that, every year the General Assembly at the UN comes together, and as you know, the General Assembly, the UN is not in America, it's just the UN, and you can, so for example, Castro and Gaddafi and all these people who normally couldn't have come in, they come in suddenly to New York, and you get this bizarre thing where, for example, for the rest of the year, the CIA try and make Fidel's cigars blow up and stuff, and then for 2 weeks, the Secret Service has to make sure that nobody touches a hair on his head until he's out of American airspace when they try and blow up his cigars again. So it's very sort of bizarre thing to see when you're in New York, and all these weird and wonderful dictators all appear, and Gaddafi pitches his tent in New Jersey, and it's just when he was still alive, obviously. And so a student of mine was slightly hungover one morning and was in a subterranean Duane Reade looking for Alka-Seltzer or something, kind of blurry-eyed. And he had been, I'd taught a class on Zimbabwe, and he'd written an essay about this and that, and he looked up, and there was Robert Mugabe, you see, in this Duane Reade, and he sort of thought, what did I smoke too much of something last night? Or what? He couldn't quite believe it. And then, indeed, there was Robert Mugabe standing there with a couple of flunkies with clipboards, and they had a shopping list from Grace, and they were in front of the lipstick counter, and they were kind of, and they're all elderly now, and they were kind of peering at the lipstick counter, and lipsticks, I'm told, have very strange names, the very sort of mulberry, blushing, something, sunset, whatever, all these things. And they were calling off these names, trying to find things. And so the student of mine thought, here I am, and here's Mugabe, this bloodthirsty dictator, in Duane Reade. Now, this is my moment, I've got to do something. So, but of course, and you say to yourself, if I had that Robert Mugabe in front of me, I'd tell him a thing or two. But of course, when you do, then all your social conditioning and everything kicks in. You sort of get shy, and so he sort of, I've got to do this, I've got to do this. So he went up to Mugabe and sort of said, and if this ever happens to you, if you happen to be in New York and there's General Assembly and a dictator passes you, you might as well, these are the rules of engagement. As long as you stay 3 feet back and don't spit or do anything physical like that, don't make any sudden movements, and don't raise your voice to an unacceptable level, then it's a free country. You can do what you can tell. You can say whatever you like to it. So he lectured Robert Mugabe for a few minutes on what a dastardly chap he was, and then to his great chagrin, he kind of ran out of things to say. So he kind of walked off across it, and then he remembered that he had his cell phone. So he went back up and took a couple of pictures of him. And so anyway, he recounted this to me in an email and attached this photograph. And so I was chuckling away and thinking, but unfortunately, then the photograph pops up, and it's in Duane Reade. It's under neon light. It's very bad lighting, whatever. Mugabe looks like $1 million. I mean, he looks like, and I just shook my head. And anyway, but the problem is that the thing with dictators is that the thing that makes them dictators, this hubris, also prevents them in many cases from nominating a non-blood relative successor, because to do so, to nominate a successor, entails facing up to your own mortality, which is something that dictators aren't terribly fond of doing by and large. And so even in his dotage, Mugabe won't, imagine that you're there, imagine you're Mugabe, imagine you have this problem, which is you're getting old, and you're a dictator, and you need a successor, and you call in, Bain or whatever, when Mitt Romney was still there or something, you call in management consultants and say, I'm a dictator of a small Central African country, and this is my problem, and could you bring me some consultants and tell me what, dictator consultants? And they would say, you would imagine, they would say, here's what you do. You get someone, you say, Peter Orner, he's my go-to guy, he's going to replace me, and you're always seen in public with him, and you visibly transfer your authority and the iconography and everything to this person. It's easy to do if you're Kim Il-sung or whatever doing to another Kim, but if it's not Mugabe's own children are too young, you would pass it on. But ZANU-PF, Mugabe in particular, is unable to do this. So there've been 1 or 2 or 3 people who pop up as in the press and in the media or whatever as being his successors. Right. And whenever one seems to be preeminent, Mugabe deliberately destabilizes them. And most recently, we had an extraordinary situation where the one who seemed most likely was burnt literally to a cinder. A guy called Solomon Majuru, who was general of the army, who was actually, his ambition was channeled through his wife, who's actually the vice president, Joyce Majuru. And he was, and there's been an inquest in Harare in the last 2 or 3 weeks about it, which I won't bore you with now, but you should read about it. But it's a fascinating thing where he's he was literally reduced to a little pile of ashes. So foul play was definitely
And what is also
suspected.
fascinating is that his wife, the vice president, is complaining about the response of the paramedics and the fire,
Right.
because they didn't have air in the tires or whatever, and I mean, all created by the government that she runs.
It's a very strange,
it's a wild situation.
But casting forward, what is worrying though is that this policy of waiting for Mugabe to die. The truth is that if Mugabe were to keel over tomorrow, it's quite possible that in the short term, Zimbabwe would get even more dangerous and be even less stable, and that there could be a kind of civil war of some sort. I mean, even within ZANU-PF, within the different factions, never mind the opposition. So that's the problem that we face down the road.
And with that, I'm going to thank you, but we're going to open up the questions for the audience. But as you say, this idea that that Mugabe being gone isn't going to be the answer. This is a much more complicated situation. I think it's a great note to end on. So at least that portion. So now we're going to hear from you all.
So just put your hand up, please,
yeah.
if you have a question for Peter
one
Orner,
here.
series over there. She'll get you. Great.
Hi. Enjoyed the book very much. Question, if you were writing the biography of Morgan Tsvangirai and the MPF, is his inability to step up and take advantage due to just a lack of personal courage, lack of infrastructure, lack of what keeps him from being a partner in a real sense?
Well, actually, he just wrote his own, well, it was ghostwritten, I think, his own autobiography, which comes in at some 800 pages. So it probably shows a lack of decisiveness in terms of editing. But actually, no. I mean, to be fair, it's certainly not a lack of personal courage. I mean, there've been multiple assassination attempts. He's been beaten up. He's been jailed. He's been tortured, and so it's absolutely not that. The other thing you must remember is that when you're trying to be an opposition party in a country that's essentially a dictatorship, you are not playing a game on an even field. The MDC is riven with spies. The CIO, the Central Intelligence Organization, which is a sort of equivalent of the FBI and the CIA rolled into one, but more like the KGB was. It has people, has infiltrators in the MDC at every level doing dirty tricks and this and that. You're listened to, your emails intercepted, whatever. It's really difficult to, So, he is criticized for a lack of decisiveness at certain points, and I already alluded to his unwillingness to sacrifice the blood of others. But I find it difficult to condemn that myself, although I'm frustrated by it in a kind of macro political way. I understand why he's doing that. So, I mean, it's very easy to criticize him, from outside, but I think that he's had enormous challenges. He's had he's had a very difficult hand dealt to him, and he's going to have to make another really difficult decision in the next year or maybe 18 months when there will be another election. It's supposed to, before that election is to happen, there was supposed to be a whole raft of reforms that will have gone through, and they haven't. So he's going to have to decide, do we go into this new election and risk a repeat of 2008, or do we boycott it, in which case Mugabe just says, thank you, and rubber stamp, I'm back in power. So, he's got to face up to that yet again.
Next question's back here.
I would imagine that you are probably political enemy number one. What does Robert Mugabe think of you?
I don't think he thinks of me at all. I mean, the thing is that I'm not a threat to him. Until very recently, books in Zimbabwe are prohibitively expensive, and people couldn't get hold of them. The thing, if you look at media in general, Mugabe, and not just Mugabe, but in the context of an African country and much the third world, you can allow, for example, opposition newspapers in the cities where the chattering classes read them and sort of, have their say, but they're not in any. It's not a wide enough group of people to really threaten any kind of power base. What they really care about, or more than anything, is FM radio. FM radio is what really gets to the people, and they won't, in Zimbabwe, they won't allow any independent radio or any independent TV. And that's ZTV and ZBC have an absolute hold on that, and that's what they really care about. They let some opposition papers in the cities and towns mostly. They don't really mind about that. In fact, it's quite useful because it again helps to give the veneer that they're pluralistic when they're really not. And it's a sort of problem that we have. If you look at the Freedom House survey of Africa in terms of how many democracies we've got. I mean, Africa's been going in the right direction. There are many, many more democracies in Africa now than there were when the Berlin Wall came down in 89, 90. There were just a handful, literally sort of 3 or 4 then, and now there are many more. But the problem is how you define a democracy. I mean, they have all these different points. You look at freedom of the press freedom of media being a major one. But in the end, it seems to me that you only really know if you're living in a democracy when there's a vote, the opposition win, the troops stay in barracks, the government changes, and people go to work the next day the same as they did yesterday. That's, and there are lots of countries like, Botswana and whatever that are hailed as great democracies, but they've only ever had the ruling party. No one has ever come in. And indeed, in that regard, the ANC, South Africa, which is preeminent country, the engine room of Africa, is going to prove to be the most interesting because we've had 4 presidents, but the ANC is still very much in power, gets routinely in the 60s to 65% support at elections. But as that erodes, if it erodes, then it'll be interesting to see how that works. South Africa has probably one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive constitution in the world, has an amazing constitution. But whether it actually conforms that, I mean, for example, in South Africa, South Africa's constitution, for example, is the most progressive in terms of gay rights, but yet South Africa is one of the most homophobic countries you'll ever go to. So it's that sort of disparity between, between the definition and the reality.
Next question is back here.
With that in mind, how do we keep up to date on Zimbabwe? What's the best way to keep up?
Well, I mean, I'm amazed. If I were doing a PhD now, if I were doing a dissertation in sort of political science, these things, one of the things I'd be very tempted to look at is the effect of the internet on the way politics now works, because what used to happen, I mean, and I'm fascinated, having been in America now for 13 or 14 years, at the difference between exiles and immigrants, people who come into this country just, looking for economic, betterment or whatever, as opposed to people who come in here having lost power after, say, the Shah of Iran gets overturned or whatever. And and what used to happen is that you'd arrive, and it was so difficult to keep in touch with home, either through letters or expensive phone calls or whatever, that very quickly you become Americanized, you forget about that, and you sort of, the next generation is very firmly rooted here. But now I know Zimbabweans who live here and in Canada and England who are in closer contact with things back home than they were when they lived there. They're online all the time. They're emailing people. They're twittering. People in Zimbabwe, have cell phones. They go to internet cafes. And so, if you really want to, I mean, try just as an experiment. You put a Zimbabwe alert on Google News or something, and just have it kick up. You'll get reports from all sorts of radios and local media and whatever. And actually, you have this weird thing where certainly I feel sometimes like I can follow Zimbabwe almost more closely from here than sometimes when I'm there, when you don't have broadband and you can't find out what's going on. So, I mean, online, certainly, you can easily follow what goes on there and in many other countries.
Just throw out one of many organizations, and Peter would know many, many more too, but there's one, especially in the news lately, but Women and Men of Zimbabwe Arise, WOZA is if you look on the WOZA website, you can see a lot of what's happening to them. In particular, they're a very powerful women's group that's often harassed, and lately have just been, the leaders have just been rearrested, so that you might want to look
and there's
into them.
an organization called Kubatana, and there's a thing called, I think it's called ZimbabweSituation.com, which just simply collects, everything and puts it out there, so you can go on that too.
I wanted to go back to Morgan Tsvangirai for a minute, and my impression is that, in fact, he has sort of lost credibility with the people in a lot of ways, just because he has been so abused, in fact, in this power-sharing arrangement. And I'm wondering what you think of his long-term prospects for actually being able to succeed.
I mean, the truth is that if there were a really free and fair election in Zimbabwe now, whatever, he would win. He would romp home. I mean, that's still the case. Having said that, there's an element of truth in what you suggest, insofar as my perception, and my caveat is I have not been back there for the last 18 months. My perception, though, from talking to lots of people, is that what's happened is that there's almost been a sort of de facto division, if you like, between the part of the MDC that's physically in this power-sharing agreement, who have ministries and cars and offices and security and whatever, and the part of the MDC that hasn't gone in, and that's a danger, that people's heads are turned by the sort of pomp and circumstance of office, and the ministerial salaries and the kudos and the whatever that goes with it, and that's. And on my worst days, I think that the danger is that the opposition is being co-opted effectively, and that they have, by going into this arrangement, they have effectively given Mugabe a lifeboat, if you like. That they've extended his rule, albeit with them sitting as a sort of handmaiden. Because let's face one thing: they have no real power. I mean, you've got a ludicrous situation where Theresa Makoni, who's the Minister of Home Affairs, which is in charge of the police, can't get the police to do what she wants. She can't get them to take meetings and whatever. I mean, she they do things that she disapproves of, and yet she carries on being minister of, in charge of them. It seems to me at a certain point you should resign when something like that happens. And that's the difficulty. She's in a quandary. I mean, she's not alone. But, in many cases, this is the problem. You get people like Tendai Biti, who's extreme, very talented, very, I'm a great admirer of his and indeed a friend, and he's the Minister of Finance, but yet this huge diamond find in Chiadzwa that's happened, that money's not going to the fiscus, it's going straight to ZANU-PF people. So again, how much do you put up with that and stay in your ministry, and how much as a government do you say, what, this is too much, we're walking, we're leaving? And they haven't left up until now. So, the danger is that the longer they stay in, the more they get compromised.
With the economy being so abysmal, where is Mugabe getting his funding?
Well, diamonds now. I mean, diamonds, and also, I mean, the economy is much better than it was, but principally because they abandoned the Zimbabwe dollar. The Zimbabwe dollar, I mean, the last note was 100 trillion, I think, $100 trillion note, and I'm really pissed off that I didn't keep more of them, because they sell for a lot of money on eBay now. It's just, they. But at the end, I think the $1 trillion note just before they were abandoned got you 2 eggs, maybe 3 eggs. That's what it got. I mean, it was more than the Weimar Republic. It was ridiculous. They used to say that at the main golf course in Harare, where the pub, I think, is inevitably called the 19th hole or whatever it's called, that you would do your 18 holes and then repair to the pub. But that by the end, you would, instead of doing it at the end, you would go in before you teed off, and you would buy all the drinks that you think you wanted and pay for them, because by the time you do 18 holes, especially if you've got a couple of people who are taking a long time to get round, the price of the beers would have gone up. So principally, the economy is stabilized. I mean, it was literally going in free fall. It's stabilized and improved, modestly, because they now use the US dollar. So at least you can have, you can pay your bills, and there isn't a hyperinflation. But no one's really investing in any big way until this conflict is resolved, with one big exception, which is the Chinese, actually, and the Malaysians. But mostly they're there on a sort of fire sale basis. They're resource hunting. They'll come in and get things at very knockdown prices and pay off who they've got to. But for ZANU-PF's own coffers, this enormous find of alluvial diamonds in the east of the country, in a place called Chiadzwa, Marangi. And alluvial diamonds are astonishing because they are, the volcanic pipes that diamonds normally come in have been disturbed by water or tectonic shifts or whatever it is, and so they're scattered on the surface or close to the surface. In other words, you don't need to spend vast amounts of capital to get at them, and so it's also impossible to tell how many there are, because they don't. they don't come in a kind of regular pipe. But they've got huge amounts there. There are various different estimates of what it is, and that's that money is basically going to the regime.
Next question is back here.
What do you wish that the world had done and when to prevent this from happening? And perhaps easiest to frame it in terms of if this were to happen again with, for example, Julian Malema in South Africa, who holds Mugabe on a pedestal, to prevent this from happening without actually offending a country's sovereignty?
Well, the sovereignty thing is very tricky, isn't it? Because people, in my experience, when people start bleating on about sovereignty, they usually don't want you to come and help to enforce democracy. In other words, the sovereignty of the people is it's usually dictators who talk about sort of some legal notion of territorial sovereignty. I mean, Africa is it's such a paradox if you think about it. If you go back, that the OAU, which was the precursor to the African Union, when it's formed, it's one of its founding principles is the sanctity of borders. But the African borders are essentially colonial borders that are invented at the Congress of Berlin. So you just in terms of colonialism's legacy in Africa, it's the gift that keeps on giving, because it keeps on giving, it keeps on stimulating instability in terms of these ridiculous borders sometimes. So where real nations have been split, and the lines of the modern statehood, often have no logic at all. They literally are arbitrary in many cases. And so that's the one problem. In general, though, I think that what happens is that in this country, and I'm not singling out America for criticism, because I do think that to some extent you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you intervene, then then you're intervening. You're criticized for that, and if you don't, you're criticized for that. It's quite a difficult thing to do. In general, though, what we tend to do, I think, in the West, is that we talk the humanitarian talk in terms of interventions, but we walk the strategic walk. And I do sometimes wish we were just more honest about it. So, for example, it seems to me that if you want America to intervene in your internal conflict, you have to have one or preferably two exports, and those exports are oil and Islamic terrorism, preferably. And so if you export both of those, then we'll be your guest. We'll be there very quickly if you're lucky or unlucky. And Zimbabwe has neither of those exports, so it's not strategic. So in this particular case, as I referred to already, we've franchised it out to South Africa. I mean, we've said, you fix it. It's in your backyard. So, but having said that, I'm not sure what else we could have done. I mean, I don't think Zimbabwe. I think there was a point in 2008 where things had got so bad that actually you could have, if South Africa had been willing, there was certainly, we should have had at the very least some kind of peacekeeping operation to stop the level of violence. And it seems to me that in 2008 it rose to a legal level of a crime against humanity. I think there's no doubt about that, and I think Peter would. I mean, just in terms of just the sheer thing to remember about Zimbabwe, because it's so literate and because there's so many civil rights workers on the ground, it's a really well documented atrocity. I mean, affidavits, sworn statements, eyewitnesses. We have got the, very, very well, as I said written the book, it's sort of gavel ready in many respects. So that'll still, and I think that there'll be a time in the future, not too distant, I hope, where that will have to be confronted, because I think one of the reasons that Zimbabwe keeps repeating this cycle of violence is that we've got stuck in a culture of impunity, and that nobody ever, we never look at the past conflict. We didn't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or anything like that, where you at least try and wrestle with what's happened, and you look in the mirror and try and figure it out so that you don't repeat it.
And just
Next question's right.
people have to
sorry.
care. People have to care on an international level, and Zimbabwe makes the news when there's big stuff going on. But we're talking daily basis stuff, and people have to care in order to get to, for example, a situation where we bomb Serbia, which that wasn't a situation where there was a real strategic interest as much, but there was public interest. But Zimbabwe, I don't see that.
But I mean, it's interesting if you look at places, Libya. Libya, there was that window where
Right.
because they were, because there was a physical split. You remember Benghazi had gone, was there, and it looked like he was killing civilians in sufficient numbers, and there was a moment where you could do it. Syria has proved a much more difficult nut to crack. Just and it's actually now spinning out of control with with suicide bombings and all sorts of things. I mean, it is very complicated. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the very first thing is that it has to get up the agenda, and it's and even in African terms, Zimbabwe's usually a poor third, say, after Darfur and Congo and and various things at various times. It doesn't even get to the top of the African to-do list.
Next question's here.
I can hold it. You do? Sorry, I'm not union. I can't hold the mic. First of all, let me thank you for your incredible books. I want to personally thank you, and in particular for When a Crocodile Eats the Sun, which is my personal favorite. My question to you, given South Africa's reluctance perhaps to try and punish comrades and the West's reluctance to step in because we haven't hit that genocide threshold, it's what we can do in terms of promoting individual entrepreneurship among the people of Zimbabwe as a way of breaking this. One of the most hopeful articles I read about Africa recently was in The Economist, talking about the role of entrepreneurship in Africa in terms of the people themselves lifting themselves out of what they were in, all this time. So perhaps we're dealing with the wrong institutions in trying to promote this change, and we should be dealing more with individuals at a different level in changing this model. And I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely true that Africa is moving from a period in its history of being an aid recipient to being an investment recipient. I think that there's money to be made in Africa. I mean, if you look at just people, outside investors and things, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that the long-term picture is probably is hopeful, notwithstanding what's been going on in Zimbabwe. And I think you're right though about individual entrepreneurs and things. And I meet lots and lots of people who are helping on a small level, or and there are lots of Zimbabweans are very industrious people, and they are very entrepreneurial. In fact, they're often called the Jews of Africa. And they in South Africa they have that reputation of instead of just sitting around being unemployed, they'll do. And that's why that's one of the main reasons that the xenophobic attacks, oddly, were on Zimbabweans mostly because they excite envy when especially in squatter camps and townships where everyone's poor. So I mean, and I think that's absolutely right. And there are, I mean, on my website, everybody has to have one now apparently. I sort of chickened out of putting a sort of top 10 of how to help, because I discovered that when I did, one of two things happened. I either had to do due diligence, constant due diligence on all these people to make sure no one was stealing money and that they were being properly audited and whatever. Instead of, if I say give money to this organization, then it discover that it's not going where it's intended. And the other thing is that once I recommended some things, then other people all screamed at me and said, why didn't you recommend us? So it's just, in the end, I kind of, it's difficult for me to say where to go, but there is a list certainly on my website, and you can get it on the web generally, of charities, and not just charities, but a lot of them are these hybrid, that they use seed money to set things up so that they can then run themselves, and it depends what you're interested in. Some people are more interested in education, some people in health, some people in food or whatever. But there are lots of, it's very active. That community in Zimbabwe is very active, and there's lots that one can do. And there are several organizations now that you can look at that will do the monitoring that I'm talking about, and will and rate various of these hybrid organizations. So there is a lot going on in Zimbabwe in that respect.
Next question is back here.
Earlier on, you mentioned that you haven't been back to Zimbabwe in 18 months. My question for you is, when you do go back, are you nervous to go back?
This is a question I don't like answering. Listen, I haven't been back since the Fear was really sort of properly published, because I think in the Fear I felt that things had got so bad that, you know, what I was reporting here had risen to such a level that I named names, and, you know, it's not composites and this and that and whatever. It's very specific, deliberately so. And when I was writing it, I knew that there would be a price to pay for that. And I've certainly been warned off, shall I say. I don't want to go into any detail, but I don't think it would be necessarily that advisable, as it were, for me to go back right now. So no, I mean, I haven't, but I hope to be able to go back before too long.
You highlight a number of experiences in your book where you sort of rush headlong into action, even though it might not be to your best interest, and then you sort of find the emotion dwindling and you sort of start trying to dig yourself out. And you highlight a number of other people who just consistently get beat down and continue fighting, and those who don't fight at all and are willing to oppress their people. This might be kind of an example of one of his unfair questions, but having immersed yourself in that society, are you able to identify anything, a trait, something about people's pasts that separates those who are willing to stand up, those who just wither and die in the face of peril, and probably the masses who you don't really highlight, who just kind of hide in fear until they feel they can come out safely?
Well, one of the most amazing things, I think, is that a lot of the people who ended up, I think, being extraordinarily brave that I've written about, the people who are most surprised by their bravery were themselves. That most of these people didn't go out intending to smother themselves in glory and be heroes. That in many respects, I mean, you can't call them accidental heroes, but they were surprised at the way they behaved themselves. And I think that depending on the circumstances, all of us have got a kind of bedrock of, you know, which we reach, and then we say so far and no further. But you don't really know where that is until you're in that situation. I mean, I remember that even from being in a war, and you'd see all these soldiers training, and some of them are very macho and gung-ho and whatever, and then when actually things start happening, it's not necessarily those people who are effective, shall we say, when there are bullets flying around, that there's actually completely different people. So it's very hard to tell who it's going to be. And many of the people that I've talked about, and that you'd written about too, I'm not dwelling on the leadership in particular at all. Quite the contrary. Many of these people are very, as it were, low-level, you know, party at village level and whatever. And they are extraordinary. I mean, the Chenjerai, the one guy I spoke to who's in one of the last chapters of the book, where he comes under attack because he stood as a local councillor an opposition local councillor in a thoroughly Mugabe area, and they then send this huge gang of sort of militias and whatever to essentially to kill him. And when he realizes that they're going to kill his whole family, he gets him to hide under the bed, and he deliberately runs out, sort of, you know, shows himself and to draw them off. And indeed, they all sort of chase him off down the hill, and eventually he's felled by a spear in the leg and sort of goes over. And he's lying on the ground, and there are all these people sort of with rocks and everything. And he's telling me the story, and he's lying on the ground, and he's telling it without any promotion. He's just telling it very matter-of-factly. And so I was saying, you know, what happened then? What did you say then? He said, I said to them, you better kill me, because if you don't, I'm going to come after you. And I said, why would you do that? Why, Chenjerai? What possessed you? You're lying on the ground. There's hundreds of them, and you taunt them like this. What were you thinking? I said, why did you say it? I mean, I'd be saying, I've error of my ways, where can I design ZANU-PF, Viva, whatever. I mean, why did you do it? And he said, why did I say it? And I said, yeah. He said, because it was true. It's just like that. And that's, you know, that's just, you know, at that point, I just have to just sign off astonished. You know?
You live to tell.
It's all of these small details and wonderful stories that enliven when the crocodile eats the sun, I think, for all of us, and put us through some of the experiences that you had. In that book, you also began to detail a personal journey, and I don't know if you'd be comfortable talking about it tonight, but in discovering your father's past and what that could mean to you, wondered if you would elaborate just a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I don't know how many of you have read Crocodile or not, but I mean, for those of you who haven't, I mean, what happened in that book, and what was an extraordinary journey for me, was that I started writing that book because that was when Zimbabwe had begun its kind of this precipitous descent. And I had written a previous book. I mean, in fact, I've now written an accidental trilogy, and I'm stopping, I promise. I might do one extra chapter to this when Mugabe really goes, because unfortunately for me, the British and Southern African version of The Fear has the subtitle "The Last Days of Robert Mugabe." So it's just when I'm challenged by audiences there, that I just say, well, it was more in hope than expectation. Anyway. But so the first book, Makiwa, goes up through the war and through Matabeleland and sort of stops there, and stops at a time when Zimbabwe was really doing quite well, and then as it sort of descended, as it went off the sort of cliff edge after 2000, I decided I had to sort of write a follow-up. And when I started doing that book, in Makiwa, a number of readers had said to me, my mother is this very finely drawn character. She's larger than life. She's a doctor in a rural area, and she's sort of an extraordinary figure. Terrible mother, probably, but no, she wasn't. I mean, she was more of a doctor than a domestic person, put it that way. But my father is this sort of rather remote character, and in truth, he was. I realized, very remote. This sort of truculent chap who strode around the bush in a safari suit with a walrus moustache and desert boots, and had a kind of force field around him. You couldn't just, he was emotionally very cut off and distant, and very curt, and spoke like a sort of Shire colonel, sort of barked in commands. So I went to various boarding schools and things, so I didn't really see them that much. And when I started writing Crocodile, my father, who, as I say, was a quintessential sort of Brit abroad, as he essentially lay dying, told me that in fact he wasn't English at all, but he was a Polish Jew, and that his family had been killed in the Holocaust. And so it was just very interesting. I mean, I was already a middle-aged man. I had children of my own. I had been to 14 years of Jesuit school. My mother, who knew this all the time, is English and is a parson's daughter, so she's what you would call Episcopalian and Anglican. So it took a fair amount of unraveling, and was a kind of, and it's an astonishing thing as a middle-aged man to have your father essentially reintroduce himself to you. He reintroduced himself to me and said, your name is not really your name. I'm not who you think I am. My bio is a lie. It's fictitious, etc., and whatever. And it's very strange. And my sister, I think, described it best, where she said it felt like when she talked to people who had only discovered that when they were adults, that they'd been adopted, in that your lived life is the same, right? You've lived the same life. That hasn't changed. But your perspective on it, the angle from which you observe it, has changed in a way that affects everything. And it's very hard to get your head around it, really, in many respects. But it made sense in lots of ways. And for me, it was just like, I just felt like, how many minorities can I belong to at the same time? I mean, it's just like, grief. This is, it's just Anglo, Ashkenazi, African, it was just, so, I mean, but yet, as a writer, in a way, it helped me to understand why I've always sort of, never really been a joiner. I feel like I'm more comfortable on the periphery, looking at how things are as a sort of observer almost. And I think that that's quite useful as a writer, actually, because that's sort of where you want to be. You want to be kind of looking in. But it's been a complicated journey that's sort of, in many ways, I think, ongoing. I mean, I subsequently went back to Poland. In Crocodile, I deliberately didn't go. I didn't do like Daniel. Yeah, I didn't do that deliberately because I wanted the flashback bit, the bit about who my father really was, to come through him. And indeed, in the book, it does. So he eventually, mostly writes me a series of letters, and we have some conversations. But it was very difficult because you think that when someone's been sitting on a secret like that when they finally reveal it, you think, I made the mistake of thinking it's now an open door. It's this door I can go in and out, and, you know, rummage around and say, oh, what was this like, you know? And I remember sitting with my father once, and you know, he knew I would write about it. That was, you know, in a way, that was his legacy to me. You know, he knew as a writer this was sort of an extraordinary story, and he was talking about stuff, and I made the mistake of having a notebook and writing, and he suddenly turned to me and he went, "It's all you do is scribble, scribble, scribble." And so after that, I realized that I couldn't write it in front of him, and but he wrote me letters, and they're sort of extraordinary. They're extraordinary letters detailing, you know, what his life was like. And when I finally went back to Poland after the book was published and everything, the book was translated into Polish, and I went to Poland and I gave a talk in Warsaw. He grew up in Warsaw, and after the talk, a very elderly Polish lady came up on a walker with her son, and she said to me, "Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it," and whatever. And I said, and then she sort of turned around to walk away, and then she thought better of it, and she sort of came back, half turned back, and she said. I knew your grandfather. And I said, "Oh gosh, really? You know, how'd you know?" And he said, "We hid him during the war." And so it's like, and I was so sort of astonished that I couldn't sort of. The only thing I could think to ask her, I said, what was he like? And she thought for a minute, and she said, "He was very well behaved." And I thought, I bet he was. That's you're a house guest in those circumstances. You really don't want to piss your hosts off.
I want to remind you that both Peter Orner and Peter Godwin will be signing books in the atrium. Thanks so much to all of you for coming tonight. Most of all, thanks to Peter Orner and Peter Godwin. Good night.